All right, everybody, just give me 1 second and we will get started. All right, if everyone can see me, can you go ahead and type it into the chat box? All right, awesome. Let's get started. Thank you all so much for joining me today. My name is Charlie Chadwick, and I am the new Rural Services Specialist with Iowa CASA. Today we're going to be talking about confidentiality in smaller communities. I'm going to be focusing primarily on rural communities today because we're going to have about 45 minutes of me talking for a little bit and giving an introduction, and a few panelists who are going to talk about their personal experiences. And this is not enough time to focus on every smaller community we have in Iowa. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on rural, and I'm going to talk about how that intersects with other types of identities and how those barriers and difficulties can be compounded based on who is seeking services. So we're going to have time at the end for a Q&A, but if there is any information or any communities you're looking for more information on, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can absolutely do another follow-up session, or I can answer some questions at the end. So the first thing that is important when working with confidentiality in smaller communities is identifying the community that you're working with. So if you're working in a rural setting and you're working with a mainstream population, identifying some of the cultural beliefs, some of the historical context to why they might be resistant to seeking out services, or if there's been any, mistrust or any things that have happened that may be creating barriers, just to fully understand who you're working with. And this is when you can also focus on if there are culturally specific groups you're looking to serve. So are those folks who are, not only living in rural areas, but might also be part of the deaf or hard of hearing population. So in their community, they might have an even smaller community. So really just focusing on making that identification and then being able to identify what concerns and barriers there are. So, most trainings that we go through on confidentiality and other things are based on more of an urban platform. So rural populations and smaller communities have very unique differences that must allow for people to have some kind of creativity when coming up with solutions. So when you're trying to identify solutions, you've got to think of things like, is just the office location presenting a barrier? Maybe is it one of the only office buildings in the area? So if someone wants to come to the office for services, they'll also have to be next to one of the only grocery stores in town, or one of the only hairstylists in town, or other service providers. So being aware that that in itself might be creating a barrier for people being able to have any type of anonymity. Being aware of the relationships that folks have to each other, to other service providers, to other community partners, the relationships people might have to the survivor or to the person who's caused harm. In rural communities, there are higher rates, studies have shown that the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, it's much higher that they will have a prior relationship. So we know that in most communities, that there's a high likelihood that the survivor is an acquaintance to the perpetrator, but that's even higher in specifically rural communities. There are also the issues of, if the only law enforcement officer in the area is someone the survivor went to high school with, or their kids play on the same teams, or the only advocate in the area is someone that the client knows in some personal context. So then once you've kind of worked through and identified what the unique situations might be in your service area, really trying to work to creatively find those solutions. So this is a good time that I always like to remind people to always embrace more education. If there are communities that you don't identify with, that you feel like you might not be qualified to work with, really work on researching those communities. Reach out to other people who might be providing culturally specific resources, and then participate in co-advocacy. So working together to find some of these solutions for clients. In rural areas and in other smaller communities, having a dual relationship might be impossible to avoid. So, with those situations where there's only one advocate or one police officer or one grocery store or one high school, these relationships might overlap in a lot of different ways. So making sure that you understand, it's okay for those dual relationships to exist as long as it's in an ethical way. And making sure that you're having the discussion about confidentiality and boundaries with your clients in the first interaction you have with them. And I know in crisis situations, this can sometimes be kind of hard if someone is talking immediately and you don't want to necessarily cut someone off. But it's really important in establishing that trust to let people know as soon as possible, ideally one of the first things you talk about, what your confidentiality and boundary policies are. So making sure that everyone has informed consent in the situation, that they are really understanding that if you see them out in public, that you're not going to acknowledge them. And I would go further to explain why that is, that you don't want to unintentionally cause them to not be able to remain anonymous in their community if someone makes an assumption about just a hello. So always making sure you're telling people from the beginning what your policies are. If you're a mandated reporter in any capacity, saying those things up front, just to make sure that you don't get into a situation where you have to backpedal and say, oh, I know I told you I was a person you can trust, but actually I have to report this, or some variation of that. Always, and in these smaller communities, make sure you're building trust in those communities by actually being involved in the community. In rural areas, they tend to have kind of an insider-outsider perspective. So if you are viewed as an outsider, you might not be viewed as a safe person to receive services from. So going to town hall meetings, going to community fundraisers, working with other organizations in your service area to make sure you're getting your face out there and familiarizing yourself with the community that you're serving. Which also leads me to, if you live in these smaller communities, being very, very conscious and aware of how you speak when you're not at work, or even when you are at work. Direct service is a very difficult job, absolutely. And we are human beings, and sometimes we like to vent about the tough days that we've had. It's important that when you're doing that, do not do that in any type of public space. Even if you are out to dinner with friends and you are, kind of commiserating about how hard of a day it is, you don't know who could be around to hear you. We've had situations where, someone has been out to dinner and their server struck up a conversation and asked about, oh, where do you work? And just from that conversation, found a connection between where the person eating dinner worked and the server, and then was paying attention to some of the other conversations happening at the dinner table, and was able to pick up on more information than they should have. Even though no confidential information was shared, people can kind of put those pieces together and come up with their own conclusions, which in really small, tight-knit communities can be dangerous. Another key part of this is being able to practice difficult conversations. So if confidentiality is an issue when maybe working in a sexual assault response team or a coordinated community response, where you might be getting pressure from other service providers to give you more information or to tell you confidential details about someone you're working with, being able to actually practice, how do you tell someone no? How do you tell someone, while respecting the work that they're doing, that you are, bound to confidentiality? One way to do that is by establishing really clear group norms. So making sure everyone is reminded often to assume best intentions. That if someone's, talking about confidential information or requesting confidential information, when you bring that up and you kind of call it out to say, that's not really okay, that isn't the way we should be talking right now, that they know it's coming from a place of best intentions and not any kind of malicious attack on their character or how they approach their job. Really encouraging self-reflection. So having spaces where self-reflection is a common part of the conversations you're having, that it, to ask someone to think about their actions and the way they view a certain situation isn't something that only comes up when something bad might be happening. And I know this is cheesy, but legitimately practicing those conversations. We think a lot about, or we see, a lot of athletes who they don't go out and play, a really big game without having practiced at all, right? When we're in that moment of our brains kind of naturally going to that fight, flight, or freeze, even with communication among our peers, it's good to be able to have that toolkit to say, I know what I want to say in this situation, I've practiced it, and I feel confident saying it, even if it might be to, someone I find intimidating or someone I've had disagreements with in the past. So, does anyone have any questions before we get started with the panelists? All right. So I'm going to open it up and we've got 3 people joining us, Barb, Brandy, and Brittany. They are the rural SART coordinators in Iowa. So they're going to be sharing some of their experiences, and I'm going to figure out how to make sure they're able to talk. All right. Barb, are you there?
I'm here.
All right, great.
Can
Would
you
you
hear
mind?
me?
I can.
Great.
Would you mind taking a minute to introduce yourself and go ahead and go through the counties that you serve?
Sure. My name is Barb Duder. I work for Rape Victim Advocacy Program in out of Iowa City, Iowa. We're with the University of Iowa. I'm the rural SART coordinator for our region. So I cover Iowa, Cedar, um, Washington, Henry, Des Moines, Van Buren, and Lee counties. Um, and I'm looking at the list of questions here. Um, chow, those are the counties I covered. Do you want to introduce everybody else, or do you want me to answer these?
I'm having a hard time getting them linked in. So why don't we start with you on some of these questions?
Great.
So what are some of the challenges that you've faced working in smaller rural communities?
From a confidential standpoint, I would say that for me, because I'm from I live in Washington, Iowa. When I'm working in Washington, Iowa, everybody knows who I am. Pretty much most of the people in the county know who I work for. My Facebook friends know who I work for. So it is not uncommon to get it's not uncommon to get calls on my personal cell phone or questions at any given time throughout the community.
Absolutely. So what are
And
some
oh, I'm sorry, and to work directly with people or with families that I know.
So how do you navigate some of those conversations, especially when there is, and are you available for a video chat?
Not right now. I'm afraid that if I try to pull up my video, it'll go crazy.
I totally understand. Um,
I'm just happy I got the mic up.
yeah, this is my first time with Zoom, so I appreciate everyone's patience. Um, so back to what you were saying, how do you navigate some of those personal relationships?
Most of it is just I try to draw a pretty strong line for people between what is business and what is personal. As far as letting people know that if I am working with them or I am working with a family member, that they really need to kind of keep going through the community, through the rape victim advocacy program channels, um, instead of bypassing and coming to me, because my role isn't advocacy. My role is a SART coordinator, and I always love to refer people back to our amazing advocates because they're the ones who can be there every step of the way.
Absolutely. So as a SART coordinator, you interface a lot with other service providers. Have you had any experience, and maybe not just in this position but in your career in general, with other service providers kind of expecting you to give them more personal or confidential information about a survivor, or requesting those things, or kind of demanding them?
Um, I just started in May, just so everybody knows. I haven't had many issues with that at all. Um, Partly because, as you said, we do lay down our confidentiality rules right away. And our service providers that we work with, they know where we stand. And that's been one of the benefits for the counties where we do have strong SART teams.
Mhm.
Um, so, we lay that out, that we separate out our roles very clearly, that there's going to be things that survivors are going to tell us and we can't share that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you've been working with folks who are understanding of that. How have you seen confidentiality be a barrier in rural communities to people seeking services?
I wouldn't say so much that it's been a barrier for me as much as it is there's always that level of everybody knows everybody. And just because I may not know somebody, I may not know the person directly, I probably know somebody who knows them who knows them. I was a very small town, and we do, occasionally you run into clients at events. Um, and when that happens, I always just, if I'm working with a client, I just directly let them know that I may see you, but I'm not going to talk to you. And I'm not going to come up and talk to you, not to be rude, but to protect you and to protect your confidentiality. And then that leaves them the consent to come up and talk to me if they want, but not to feel obligated.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Um, so it looks like we are having some issues getting the other two panelists on the line. So for folks who are viewing the webinar, do y'all have any questions or any experiences that you've had with confidentiality that you've had a hard time navigating? All right, so okay, so I've I've had it when a client comes to me in Walmart while I'm with my husband and I don't know how to do introductions. Dot dot dot. Now my husband knows better. Um, it's funny you mentioned that. That is a conversation that I've had with my partner as well. Of really establishing with people in your inner circles of there might be people I interact with, but my job is confidential. So what that means is that even if you also know that person, even if someone comes up to me in public, I'm, you know, you're not allowed to have any follow-up questions. But I do always encourage folks when you are having that confidentiality and boundaries conversation with clients that you let them know um, that if they want to initiate a conversation, that it's okay for them to do that, but you will never initiate any kind of interaction with them. Does anyone else have any experiences? And I do have a few scenarios, so I'm going to ask people what their opinions are on this. All right, so this actually fits really well with the example of a client coming up to you in a store. So a client comes up to you while you're out to eat with your partner and your child. Your child's in class with your client's child. Your client makes a statement about their case and then leaves, even after you've had the communication about confidentiality and boundaries. How would folks talk with their family and their child about this? All right, folks, there are about 30 people on this webinar. I know someone's got an answer.
Charlie, this is Brandy. Can you hear me?
I can. Hello.
Oh, hello.
Sorry about that. For being a millennial, I'm not very good with technology, so I
That's okay.
apologize. Well, thank you for joining us, Brandy. Do you want to go ahead and give us an introduction?
Sure. My name is Brandy Lewin, and I am the Rural Sexual Assault Response Team Coordinator for, I work for Riverview Center and cover 12 counties in Northeast Iowa. I can name them all off for you, but if, just to give you a good idea, it's the entire area over in Northeast Iowa from about the Dubuque area all the way up to the Minnesota border.
Very nice. What are some of the challenges, and how long have you been in this role, I guess?
Just a couple of years. I would say about 2.5 years. I've been doing this and just slowly establishing the teams. We've got 12 rural counties to establish them in, and I've got 9 up and running so far.
Great. So what are some of the challenges you've experienced with confidentiality in your service area?
Okay, so I think the first thing coming in that I was getting feedback, my goal was to meet as I go into a new service area is to meet individually with each component of the SART team, so each discipline. And right away, some of the questions that I get, particularly from prosecution and law enforcement, is the confidentiality piece. You know, if we're going to give you information, what's the give back? Because they want to see an advantage or a good reason to buy in. And so immediately, what I have done is establish the ground rules right from day one and explaining the benefits of that. So from an advocacy standpoint, I obviously am coordinating, so I'm not an advocate. I'm trained in that, but I'm not working as an advocate. It's just to establish the benefits of the confidentiality with advocacy. Also noting, particularly to law enforcement, because their level of confidentiality is very different than the rest of us, as you all know. So kind of letting them know, you know, coming to the table, what is that going to look like? You know, we ask that you do keep things confidential, and here are the reasons why. Explaining some of the benefits of advocacy confidentiality, such as this is a person that the survivor can trust. They're more likely to cooperate with you in the future if they wish to do so, if they know that they've got someone in their corner that they can safely tell them things. Also establishing, we do SART forms. So each team member has to sign a confidentiality agreement along with any kind of case review that we're going to do within the team. We have the survivor sign a confidentiality agreement or a release for information to the particular members that would be working on their case. It could be the SANE, it could be law enforcement, prosecution, and of course advocacy, and they can exempt anyone that they wish. We also will ask people to step out of the room if they have no interest in the case whatsoever. Even though those waivers can sometimes indicate that they don't mind the entire team talking about it, I don't see any reason to have anyone else invested in the conversation that doesn't need to be there. So I guess right off the get-go is kind of getting that buy-in or feedback and establishing that conversation and letting people know why confidentiality is so important. And even though all roles work very differently, giving them a reason as to why it is important for that confidentiality.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yep.
And we have a question from someone that I want to open up to Barb and to Brandy, as well as the rest of the group, is what if you know someone who's in a DV situation, but they haven't told you personally and they don't know about your services? Is it okay to slip that person a brochure in the next run-in?
This is Brandy. I would say yes. I think that gets tricky and it's situational. But I have had, I guess this is not, well, on a personal note, I have seen on social media someone who has given indication outwardly that they were in a situation, and I've personally inboxed them that here's some information. I guess if it was coming from someone else and not them directly, I think that gets a little bit tricky and depends on your relationship with that individual. If you're hearing it from someone that you know, you could also give the information to them and have them pass that along. That would be my take on it.
Absolutely. Barb, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think, to echo Brandy, I think so much of it is situational, especially when you're talking about written material and the safety of the person in that situation. As far as domestic violence, we know statistically the most dangerous time for a person in a domestic violence situation is when they try to leave. So if it can be communicated in a way that doesn't risk the survivor's safety, but it would be better to find perhaps another way to get that information out, without going directly, without knowing the exact situation. It's hard. But without directly approaching that person unless you have a very close relationship, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to make that decision. They'll have to make that choice. And as much as in our work we'd like to direct them one way, we have to allow them that power and control, if that makes sense.
No, that absolutely makes sense. Thank you so much. And that really, reminds me that there are some very clear, cut and dry confidentiality and boundary rules that exist. They exist to protect our clients as well as protect us. But there are also some of these areas where we are using our best judgment based on how well we know our community, the people that we're working with. And my suggestion is that if you ever have those questions where you're feeling like it could be on the fence as to whether it be something that's okay or not, always just find someone, whether it's in your organization or at the state level or, anyone else who you can trust to kind of work through that with, who will kind of be able to understand the situation a little bit better. So, both of your, well, at least Barb, I know you're both cover a lot of counties, but some of your offices at least are connected to other organizations or businesses. How do you address that concern about being recognized going into that space? And this is for both Barb and Brandy.
Can you clarify that a little bit for me, Charlie?
Yeah. So if survivors are concerned about going to your office, knowing that they may have a friend who works in one of the offices next door, or that they might run into someone they know walking into Riverview.
Okay. What I would recommend is for the advocates is to just simply ask the survivor where they're comfortable meeting. I know a lot of our advocates are meeting, we can only have so many offices. It would be ideal if we had an office in every county and every town that we serve. But the reality is funding doesn't allow for that. So nor do we necessarily want or need that. So I think asking them up front when you have that initial phone call or interaction is, where are you most comfortable meeting? It might be someone likes to meet at the library in a confidential space. I know we've got advocates who have sat in a car because someone felt safer there just driving around, which, I mean, depending on the situation, whether or not that's safe or not. So really just feeling them out and asking them bluntly, where are you most comfortable? Some people don't care if they're walking in. I know our Dubuque office is in a long line of other businesses, so people can see them walking in and out. So it'd be easy to tie. The Manchester office where I'm housed out of, we have a substance abuse center and a DNR building that's connected. Although it's private, if someone saw us park down there, they could give indication to where they're going. So it might just be a thing of, simply, I guess the simple answer is just asking them and finding out where they're most comfortable.
Great, thank you. Barb, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I would pass that off to the advocates because I don't do one-on-one client meetings. It's just not within what I am responsible for.
Absolutely. So in either of your experience, have you dealt with folks in other service providers, even talking about, kind of vaguely about certain cases or certain survivors or clients in any kind of negative way? Have you had to address, I guess, to clarify that, have you had to address other services speaking negatively or about clients at all in situations where they shouldn't be?
Okay, I'll jump in. I like to chat, this, Charlie. So yes, I have run into, and here's a really good example, and this will kind of back off of the earlier question that Barb answered regarding, I guess, confidentiality and just issues in general of running into other service providers or other disciplines. Currently, I actually got a phone call this morning, and this is a conversation where I will have, I guess this is a situation where I will have a conversation, and I guess this is a perfect example. We have a situation where we've got law enforcement in a county that, first of all, the school had reached out and said that there was a survivor that had disclosed this week with the potential of wanting an advocate and asked for some guidance on the process and moving forward, what that should look like. And then I find out that the chief of police is also a football coach, and the perpetrator is a football player. So the chief, being in a small town, and this is where the past conversation was what happens when you know people in your community. So the right thing in my mind immediately would be that the chief would step aside, right? Because that would be, an interest in this case that he shouldn't have. There's a lot of conflict there. But he did proceed to interview the perpetrator, but had discussed with him more of football discipline. And also we're running into the school district doing their own internal investigation and asking questions and kind of feeling things out for more of a discipline within the school district. And then we've got, and where this kind of turned is the school guidance counselor this morning said to me, well, people are really coming down on this child. They're calling her all kinds of vulgar names. And, I was believing her, but then I had the cheerleading squad come in and tell me that everything that she was saying was a lie. So now I don't know what to believe. And I said, well, we need to start by believing, because to me, that's saying something negative about her, because the girl admitted to having a past and she had been promiscuous, which has absolutely nothing to do with the assault. And the way that she chooses to live her life does not impact whether or not she was sexually assaulted. And so I had to have that conversation. But with that, also the police chief is now kind of interjecting of, this is a good kid. He wouldn't do this. And she is saying that he called her this, but I know that he would never call her this. So basically he's victim blaming, and also denying her. She has no chance in my mind. And so I have run into roadblocks like that. It's currently ongoing, and this is a conversation when I get back. I will definitely have a conversation with the chief about this because he has too much personal interest in this case where he shouldn't be investigating this, and B, the language that he is using and the school is using is very victim blaming, and I'll just use the word slut shaming because those are some of the words that the students were using and the guidance counselor had used. So yes, I do run into that, and I think that's something that has to be addressed on site and on spot as that comes along, because we, being a part of a group, as far as me coming from a multidisciplinary team or a SART team, the whole point of being on the team is to avoid these things and to stop these things from happening every day, right? So, if you're going to be a part of something like this, I think we need to be very upfront and honest and kind of explain it in that way. I've had county attorneys reach out to me and, can you help me to force this person to continue on? She now wants to recant. No. Why are you a part of this team? What, kind of explaining to them, let's go back to the basics of victim services and why we're here working together, which is to support their choices. And so sometimes they don't like what I have to say, but just addressing it in a respectful way and saying, hey, thank you so much for asking me about this or coming to me about this or reaching out for advocacy within the team is great. But how can we get better? Because this isn't working very well. This isn't the best. And usually, so far I haven't had any blowouts with anyone, but I'm sure they don't always like what I have to say. But I don't know if that helps a little bit to answer your question. But I think, as providers or coordinators, we have a duty to really advocate for these people and make sure, I think building these relationships so that you can have these kind of conversations with people is what's so important. And so from a coordinator standpoint, I'm fortunate enough that that's what I do every day, all day. But from an advocate standpoint is really taking part in your local SART teams or multidisciplinary teams, or getting in and really connecting to other providers and other disciplines and building those relationships. So when you have to have those hard conversations, it comes across as more out of respect and putting the victim first versus just telling someone that they're doing a shitty job, if that makes sense, if I'm going to be really blunt about that.
No,
Does that help?
No, that makes total sense. And
Okay.
I think that kind of goes to what strategies do you have when having these conversations with people in the community? I completely agree that, when you build these relationships and foster these relationships, you are able to get a sense of trust. And so you can, you'll be able to gauge whether someone will know and understand that you are coming from a place of respect, not from, being patronizing or blaming or whatever else.
Right.
And
I
then,
go ahead.
go on.
Sorry. Oh, what I was going to add to that is really being mindful that, we oftentimes will look at our other disciplines and other service providers, and it's easy for us to judge how they're doing their jobs. But I think we need to look on the receiving end of that as well, as if someone comes to you and says, why did you do this? Or why do you do this way? Or I didn't agree with how you've done something. We're not all perfect either. I think being open and listening to what they have to say is just as important as us being able to do that. And if you can, look at both sides of the fences, and we all can stand to better ourselves when working with these providers. And there's a lot that we can learn from them too, whether it's another DV advocate or a shelter or law enforcement or prosecution or a SANE. I think we need to be able to take their feedback without blowing up or getting defensive. And you may not agree with them, but really take that in and try to find a piece of where they're coming from and apply that to your job as well.
Absolutely. And, I completely agree with that. And we'll also acknowledge that can be very, very hard if you are working in a community where there's a pretty steep learning curve with some of the systems. So again, that's kind of where some of that practice can come in of, if you know about yourself that maybe addressing something in the moment, you might not be able to kind of keep some of your emotions to the side, then being able to have a follow-up conversation with someone outside of that space in a more private way, and then even talking to them about, coming up with a way to address that to the group so that that behavior doesn't go unchecked to everyone else thinking that, making those statements is acceptable. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we have about 14 minutes left, and I was going to open it up to see if anyone else had any questions or experiences to share. All right, well, Brandy and Barb, do either of you have anything else you'd like to share?
I don't think so. I think it's just I think the confidentiality definitely needs to be upheld. I think it can get tricky if you're on teams where you're doing case review, is just making sure that you're have a really strong protocol in place to ensure that you're protecting the survivor and make sure that they're okay with those conversations. It's easy to also get connected to other providers because you feel like the safety net, especially when you're crossing over with other advocates from other agencies, is just to remember that, we may be working towards the same direction with the survivor, but that doesn't mean that, it's okay to discuss things amongst them. So, and just laying out everything right out front about confidentiality, people understand. It's just that it's in your presentation, and making sure that you're presenting it well and respectfully, and giving good reason as to why you need to be confidential and why that's important to the survivor, but also beneficial to others around you.
Absolutely, thank you. Barb, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No. I think y'all have done an awesome job.
Well, thank you, and thank you both so much for being on today. I really appreciate it. I think confidentiality is an ongoing conversation. It's something that we always need to be kind of keeping at the front of our mind, remembering that even in those moments when we are, maybe feeling a little bit burned out or feeling like we need some sense of to commiserate with someone or have some kind of camaraderie, that the foundation of the work that we do is confidentiality. So we always need to keep that at the front of all of our decisions and all of the relationships that we're building. And if anyone has any questions that they would like to talk with me privately, or requests for any kind of webinar information on confidentiality in communities that aren't rural, feel free to reach out. My email is charlie, CHARLIE, @iowacasa.org. And I'll stay on for a couple more minutes if folks still want to ask any other questions. But thank you both again, Bart and Brandy. I really appreciate you coming on. You both have a lot of great insight.
You bet. And Brittany wanted to be on, but she is sick today.
Well, thank you for letting me know.
Yeah.
Letting us know. And I hope she feels better.
Me too. Charlie,
Yes.
I do have a question.
Ah,
Does the coalition have, and I don't know if others can speak to this or not, do the do you have copies of kind of what the confidentiality policy? I know like we've got it written into our agency policy, but is it do most organizations have just a zero tolerance um, policy built in for breaking confidentiality, or what does that look like?
that's a really good question. That I don't know I necessarily know the answer to. I can say from my experience, the places that I've worked in the past, it has been, oh, Maggie said what I was about to say. It's usually program specific. So there are certain instances that it's absolutely like no tolerance. But then are typically places that leave it a little bit more nuanced.
Okay.
Hey, Brandy.
Mm-hmm.
This is Barb. Ours at RVAP is it's rock solid.
Okay.
Anything that anytime we have to provide any kind of information about a survivor, we always ask them to do a very specific release.
Okay. We do too.
Mhm.
I just was kind of wondering on, zero tolerance or if it's case by case kind of situation.
I just always assume zero tolerance.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
And it looks like Maggie just said that it's a member standard and advocate code of ethics violation. So survivors or others can file a complaint with the coalition for violating confidentiality.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks, Maggie.
Charlie, one suggestion for future too, is I'm just sitting here processing. Sorry to keep talking.
No.
Is looking at confidentiality as far as what that looks like on social media. I know I've seen organizations post stories with photos of survivors, and I would bet my life that they're definitely getting permission or signed releases. But I know in the past our organization has not particularly supported doing that as much. I think they're great stories to tell because when people put a face on things and tell their story, it's really helpful and helps people to really grasp onto that. But also looking at media, so getting calls from media on certain cases. So that might be something for the future too, is with living in a world of social media, is kind of what that looks like, or a solid protocol on something like that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the suggestion.
Yeah.
Another good comment from Maggie. Hey, Brandy, that's another great point. Your organizations can create social media policies for employees to follow for confidentiality. Kelsey, our office techie, can review policies for programs. Kelsey at iowacasa.org.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've got, Maggie, I know we have a social media policy, and it's more about, not staff not discussing things, but I would be curious to see kind of statewide what people do as far as with consent, posting stories of, or get a perspective from the coalition on posting stories, success stories of survivors, or, survivors and advocates being able to team up on media TV programs and that kind of things. Because I know with SART, I would love to be able to tell success stories of individuals who have worked with an entire discipline, or a whole group of individuals, to be able to get that message out there and how that's looked or benefited them. But I'm not sure, what that looks like, or if it's ethical. Like I said, I know other organizations do that, but is it just releases, or is it just a bad idea in general?
I don't know if you can see the chat box, but
I'm not. Yeah, I don't. I just have my phone to my ear.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't just repeating things you could already see.
Nope.
Maggie suggested we could have a Zoom chat /meeting/discussion all about how we use social media. And
Okay.
that way, peer programs can exchange strategies.
I think it'd be great.
I
agree. I'd love to have something like that because, we have a strong policy about not accepting friend requests from survivors, that sort of thing, for obvious reasons. But I have to monitor my Facebook page very closely, looking for friends who like to dump stupid stuff on there. Like one of the 2% where it was a false accusation, because people know where I work. They like to, and I usually get rid of those friends very quickly. But, we still have to have lives outside, even though this is in rural communities, it is a 24/7, 365. You're at Walmart just trying to pick up some shampoo and somebody's got a question about what you do.
I agree. I think that would be a great conversation to have. Just taking notes so I can remember all of this.
I actually had to educate a pharmacy technician regarding, they asked me a question about Plan B, and they believed that Plan B caused abortions. It was an abortion pill. So, you're standing there at the Walmart pharmacy saying, well, no, that's not what this does.
That is definitely a very difficult situation, with people knowing your position and talking to you about even personal disclosures in very open spaces. I ran out to run an errand to get something for a fundraiser we were having, and the person checking me out asked what I was getting and then disclosed a lot of personal history, and how to kind of I think it would be good to have kind of more conversations about how do people handle that situation, how, with is there a way to be very respectful while also providing, a level of support and, more than anything, information on how to reach out to advocates in the future.
I agree.
It looks like there's some comments in the text box. I don't know if you can see those, Charlie.
Yeah, so from Roseanne, hi, if I remember correctly, in one of the webinars on confidentiality, advocates are not supposed to befriend the survivors in social media. Absolutely. Yeah, and different organizations have, different policies on the length of time that needs to happen between someone being a client and, it needs to be 2 years before a personal relationship happens. I think that would also be really useful to have kind of in the broader conversation about social media.
I think you could spend a day on talking about social media.
Hmm. And Maggie has another great point. That's a conversation you can have kind of as you are communicating confidentiality and boundaries to the person you're working with. All right, does anyone have any last thoughts? All right, well, thank you all so much. And thank you to everyone's participation. And again, to Barb and Brandy. And I will type my email one last time so y'all have it. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.